What I want to do this morning is present to you an inconvenient truth, a very inconvenient truth. Now let me begin. Now I actually had a dream last night, and I don't even remember who it was in the dream. It was somebody in the church that asked me, basically that said, could you please just tell us about Christmas this Sunday? So I'm going to talk about Christmas this Sunday. I want to give you, though, an inconvenient truth, and I'm going to begin, though, by stating what I'm not talking about. When I say an inconvenient truth, there are often truths that are inconvenient to us because they contradict some idea we have or some direction that we're already determined to take. I chose this title this week, and as I chose this title, I was looking something up, and I didn't realize this. Several years ago, Al Gore, I guess he produced and starred in a movie called Inconvenient Truths. The point of the movie, the point of the documentary was basically that if we don't completely change the way we do life in 10 years, this world will not even exist, right? Well, I have an inconvenient truth for him. It's been well over 10 years and we're still here, okay? When I say inconvenient truths this morning, I'm not so much talking about truths that contradict us. I'm not talking about truths that are inconvenient. I'm talking about truths about inconvenience. How many of you have ever been frustrated, and probably every hand should go up, you've been frustrated by a sudden change in plans? A person who seems to be slowing down your schedule? I've ridden with some of you, okay? You should raise your hand at that point. Maybe you've been frustrated by demands that, legitimately are beyond your control. What if I told you this morning that those things may actually be God things? I want to make just a very clear and a very simple point this morning. That point is simply this. Interruption may be intervention. There are many places in Scripture we could turn to illustrate this truth, but there's none more appropriate at this time of year than the Christmas story. So we're going to look at Luke chapter 2. We're going to begin our reading in verse number 1 this morning. Luke 2, verse 1 says this. And it came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This census first took place while Cyrenius was governor of Syria. So all the world, all went to be registered, everyone to his own city. Verse 4 says, Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David. Verse 5 said he did this to be registered with Mary, his betrothed wife, who was great with child. Verse 6, so it was that while they were there, the days were completed for her to be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling cloths and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. Now you're so very familiar with this story, and you're probably actually too familiar with this story. You know it so well, and I know it so well, it doesn't mean to us what it should mean. When you look at what I just read, honestly, everything about this situation, everything about it's bad, except the outcome. Everything about this story is inconvenient except the way it ends. If I could divide the story itself up into kind of three divisions. First, there was an inconvenient order. If you look again at verse number 1, we're told it came to pass in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was somewhere maybe around 3 BC. Rome had conquered at this point. They were occupying the land of Israel. Israel was basically a vassal kingdom to Rome. Israel had its own government, but its government had no real power outside of the power that Rome granted to it. Now, one can imagine that in fact, you see it come up over and over in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels. One can imagine that the relationship between Rome and Israel was hostile. It was tense at times. Caesar Augustus is the emperor at this point. Verse 1 told us that. He was really the first emperor of the United Roman Empire. He was Julius Caesar's nephew. When Julius Caesar died, it was left in his will that his nephew Octavius, who he adopted, become the ruler of the empire. Of course, through a series of battles, eventually he became the supreme ruler of the Roman Empire. It was after this consolidation, after this confirmation of power, that Octavius, or as we know him, Caesar Augustus, ordered this registration of everybody who lived in all the Roman provinces across the known world at that point. Some of your translations will say that he ordered that all the world should be taxed, while others will say he ordered all the world to be registered. And really, both in a sense are true. Both are accurate. You could put it this way. This registration was for taxation. The census was about currency. Octavius was as really the first emperor, he was building the empire. He was conquering new lands. He was building new roads, and every bit of that cost something. Octavius wanted clear records to ensure everyone was paying their fair share, paying their taxes. Now, I wouldn't say that Octavius was an especially bad man, but really this whole event was about two things and two things only, and that was money and power. So early in his reign, he orders that the whole Roman Empire, and in a lot of ways that was the known world at the time, the whole Roman Empire, everyone had to go back to his hometown and be registered so that he could be taxed. Therefore, verse number 3 says, "So all went to be registered, everyone to his own city." Now, I don't think this has to be stated, but we'll point it out here just to be clear. There wasn't any choice, there wasn't any deliberation on this matter. When Caesar spoke, you either said yes, sir, or you lost your head. There wasn't a whole lot of middle ground there. When Caesar spoke, people listened. Everyone within the boundaries of the Roman Empire, no matter their social status, no matter what they had or didn't have, everyone in the empire had to act on this order regardless of how inconvenient it was. And this order was particularly inconvenient. First of all, it was inconvenient because of the time of year. This likely took place sometime during the late harvest season. I can prove that to you. In an agrarian culture, in a farming culture, this could not have come at a worse time. Now, if you were wondering how I arrived at the conclusion that this happened sometime around the end of harvest, let me give you a couple of important facts. We know later in the story, the angels show up and they speak to the shepherds. And what does the scripture say? The shepherds were out in the field keeping watch over their flock by night. Typically, shepherds pastured their flocks out in the open from spring till fall. In the fall, in late October, the shepherds would bring their sheep back into the folds near the city for warmth and for shelter. So it can reasonably, now I know this is really going to upset some of you, but it can reasonably be concluded the birth of Christ was probably not anywhere near December. It was probably sometime toward late fall, sometimes toward between September, October, maybe August. There's a second clue elsewhere in Scripture. You remember Elizabeth was 6 months pregnant when the angel first visited Mary. Mary went to her cousin Elizabeth. Elizabeth is 6 months pregnant, according to Luke 1:36. Elizabeth became pregnant soon after Zacharias arrived back from his rotation serving in the temple. Elizabeth's husband Zacharias was one of the priests. The priesthood was divided into 24 divisions. They served on a rotating schedule. So outside of the high priest, it wasn't the same priest constantly serving. It was a rotation of men in and out through the year. Zacharias was of the family division, the family of Abijah. Therefore, he was 10th in the rotation. We know if you go back to Leviticus, his rotation fell somewhere between, in our modern months, somewhere between late May or mid-May and early June. So think about this. If Elizabeth became pregnant soon after Zacharias returned home, then that would mean that Mary arrived somewhere between November and December at Elizabeth's house. Since we know that Mary had just found out she was expecting when she went to visit Elizabeth, you count 9 months from November or December, and you'd be looking at a due date for Mary of somewhere between mid-August and mid-September. Now, you might think, okay, that's kind of boring. That doesn't mean a lot to me. But it should, because I want you to think about this. These are interesting facts, but I don't just point out them to show you that I read some history this week. I point those things out to you because I want you to understand how inconvenient of a season this would have been when Caesar's order came down. This was the worst time of year for farmers who did not live in their ancestral hometowns to be forced to leave home and participate in the census. This wasn't just a bad time for the farmers. This was a bad time for everybody because this was an agrarian economy. If the farmers aren't reaping their harvest, then no one eats, right? It's affected everyone. If the crops weren't harvested, food would be scarce. No matter what field you were employed in, this just really didn't come at a good time. And on top of that, it happened right at Christmas. Now, if you don't get the joke I just made, then I feel for you, okay? Not only was there, the time of year was very inconvenient, but this really was inconvenient because of the personal cost it would have meant. Not only did this order come at a bad time, it also came with great expense. Now, this isn't true for everyone, but it would have certainly been true for some. Anyone who had moved out of their ancestral homeland, their ancestral territory, would have to have traveled back to wherever they were originally from, wherever their family was originally from, to be registered among their extended family. Now, today we have government programs for absolutely everything, but there were no government assistance programs then. So think about this. Those who are already poor, those who are already barely scraping by, are not only ordered to leave home at this inconvenient time when they need to be harvesting their crops, they're called to do it at their own personal expense. They've got to pay for the journey. To those who already had little or nothing, this was an economically devastating order that they had no choice but to comply with. So this was doubtless an inconvenient order. But I want to point out secondly to you, it wasn't just an inconvenient order, there was also an inconvenient journey. Look at verse number 3. So everyone went to be registered, everyone to his own city. Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem. Why? Because he was of the house and the lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed wife, who is with child. Because Joseph's a descendant of David, he has to return to Bethlehem, his ancestral hometown, to be registered. He doesn't have a choice. But the real problem for Joseph was not just is he going to have to pay for this trip, but at this particular time, Joseph is living 70 to 80 miles north of Bethlehem in a place called Nazareth. That means that Joseph is going to have to make a trip somewhere between 70 to 80 miles south. To us, that's only maybe, an hour drive. Yesterday, in I guess a little close to 6 hours, I drove about 400 miles. Okay? For Joseph, the average man at this time would have walked somewhere between 20, 25 miles a day. So even for Joseph by himself to make this journey, it's a 3 or 4 day walk. But that's not the biggest deal. You already know the story. Joseph's not a single man. He's got a young wife, and not only does he have a brand new wife, she also happens to be nearly 9 months pregnant to the day. Now, please forgive me for what I'm about to say. My wife isn't here, so I can say this, and if you report it to her, I will deny it, and I will remove it from the video. Okay? When you add a woman to the mix, much less a pregnant woman, everything takes longer. Okay? And men, don't laugh. It's easy to see how the ETA would have been literally pushed back considerably, because now Joseph's not just walking by himself 70 to 80 miles. He's got a young wife to carry. Again, I know every Christmas I have people come up to me and say, why do you have to ruin everything? And I have to ruin everything because it's just not biblical. Okay? We often picture Mary riding on a donkey, as Joseph guided that little family to Bethlehem, but that's likely inaccurate. Of course, the text says nothing about a donkey. Now you could say, but that doesn't mean there wasn't one. Yeah, it also doesn't mean there was one, though. So the Bible doesn't tell us anything about a donkey, and why would I assume there wasn't a donkey? Let me tell you. Joseph appears to have been on the low side of the income spectrum. Now, he was a carpenter, but that doesn't mean he was in any sense successful or comfortable. Really, a carpenter of that time would have kind of been on the lower labor scale. We can safely assume that Joseph was a poor man because of the gift that they brought to the temple at Jesus' dedication. You remember in Luke 2:23, when they came to dedicate Jesus, what did they bring? A pair of turtle doves. When the Old Testament, after a child was born, the mother was to offer a sacrificial lamb to the Lord. If the family couldn't afford a lamb, 2 young pigeons or turtle doves would be accepted. So we know just by the offering they gave that they were a poor family. They weren't comfortable. They definitely weren't wealthy. It's therefore reasonable to conclude a donkey at that time was the high-end means of transportation, okay? It's very logical to conclude they probably didn't have a donkey, which means they would have been forced to make this entire journey on foot. Now, ladies, imagine this if you will. Imagine having to make a week-long journey on foot, not even on paved roads and sidewalks, but up and down hills through dusty, dirty, unpaved roads imagine walking 70 to 80 miles at 9 months pregnant. Men, imagine being forced to take your family out of town at your expense to fulfill a government mandate that you don't agree with, ordered by an emperor that you don't even believe has the right to rule over you. Everything about this journey was inconvenient. Look, number 3, there was also an inconvenient birth. Look again at verse number 6. So it was that while they were there, the days were completed for her to be delivered. Verse 7, and she brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. Now I kind of imagine Mary and Joseph arriving in town. Of course, this is my imagination, but imagine Mary and Joseph arriving in town just in time to get their business accomplished before the Roman representatives closed the office for the day. Joseph gets his name where it's supposed to be on the right piece of paper. But now it brings up the question, where are we going to sleep tonight? Remember, Mary and Joseph here were not the only two that has made this journey home. Bethlehem was probably overflowing with people because of everyone that's had to come back to the city for the registration. When Mary and Joseph arrived in Bethlehem, the local inn was already booked solid. We sometimes kind of get aggravated at the innkeeper. How dare him not give them a room? The innkeeper was just doing his job. Right? Everybody else had already paid. The rooms were already full. There just wasn't any more rooms. Not even that stinky room that nobody wants to stay in. Nothing's available. Imagine here Mary and Joseph are. They're 80 miles from home. They've been walking for at least over a week. They've just signed up to pay taxes out of money that they don't even have. And now they're unable to find a place to spend the night when all of a sudden Mary looks at Joseph and says, I think it's time. If it went that way, and we don't know exactly how it went, but we know they can't find a place to stay. We know that at some point in all this, the time is fulfilled and Mary goes into labor. And look, there's no angel singing. There's no choir surrounding her. There's no halo. It was every bit the process of normal mortal labor. I mean, she literally went to the jaws of death to bring this little baby into the world. Everything about it was bloody. Everything about it, there were screams. And it all takes place where you keep the cows. If it went that way, think about this for Joseph. When she looks at him, he's just had to make her walk a week, 10 days. They've done their registration. He can't find one place in the city. The inn's completely full. He can't find anywhere in the city to stay. She looks at him and says, it's time. Can you imagine the panic that must have filled Joseph's heart? And we don't know exactly how Mary and Joseph ended up where they did that night, but I do have my opinions. We often in our little Christmas plays, the innkeeper says, well, I do have a stable, and he takes them back to the stable. But again, that probably isn't accurate because at this time, often there weren't stables. Often if a family did possess animals, the animals stayed in a partitioned part of the house. Okay? What I kind of imagine here, Joseph is panicked. He's looking for somewhere to stay, and he looks right outside of Bethlehem. There's a little field out there, and in that field there's this little structure, a little unoccupied tower. You can say it's a stable, maybe it was a cave. We don't know exactly what, but Joseph sees this one place where there's at least shelter, and Joseph rushes in, and he begins as quickly as he can to prepare a place for Mary to have this baby. Imagine the labor, the screams, the literal blood, sweat, and tears as Mary lays there in the hay giving birth like an animal. The words of the text really paint a tame picture of what this probably looked like. When Mary finally gave birth to her first son, here she is, she's tired and weary, but there's no midwife, there's nobody to help. She has to take the swaddling cloths, and I don't know if she packed the swaddling cloths. Some say that she used the rags that were there in the barn or in the stable or the cave or wherever it was. It was typical to wrap babies at this time. It was kind of a way to keep them from breaking bones, and you would swaddle the babies much like we do today. Whether she had these rags with her or whether she just found something laying around, she's exhausted from childbirth, and she takes this little baby that is really God in flesh, and she just wraps him in little rags, and she lays him down in a feeding trough so he can rest, and so can she. Now, what a story. And I'm sure that I haven't come anywhere close to all the drama of what really happened. But there's a truth about inconvenience that I think glares back at us from this text. I mean, if you can look at this story and think, yeah, I'd like my life to work like that. The truth that glares back from this text is that what we deem as inconvenience may actually be an act of divine intervention. Again, I want to say interruption may be intervention. There is always another side to every story, and in this case, the missing side to the story is God's side that's being left out. At first glance, it looks like a bad man made a bad decree that brought about a bad result, but in reality, what's going on here is a good God is acting through a bad thing to bring about a good thing. Ultimately, it was not Caesar. You look at this story and think that Mary and Joseph are just having to march to the beat of Caesar's drum. That's not it at all. Ultimately, it was not Caesar who was pulling Joseph and Mary's strings. It was God who was pulling Caesar's strings. Scripture says in Proverbs 21:1 that the heart of the king is in the hands of the Lord. Just like a river of water, God turns the heart of the king wherever He wants to turn it and makes him go where He wants him to go. I want to encourage you today, if it's true, and it is, if it's true that God is a sovereign God, then inconvenience is actually not a thing to be despised, it's a thing to be embraced, because it is actually very likely God Himself acting. Whether you can see it or not, whether I can see it or not, God is always at work in both the minor and the major details of our lives to accomplish His good purpose both in us and through us. I want to point you to a scripture you know, and most of you can quote it, but I want you to get the meaning of it. Romans 8:28, Paul writes, we know, we're confident of this. We don't have any doubt about this. This is definite to us. We know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. There is definite parameters here. Yes, everything works together for good. You often hear people say at a funeral, or you hear them say when something bad happens, well, everything works together for good. But that's not always true. The Scripture here says this is for the people of God. For the people that have come to Him, the people that love Him, the people that are called according to His purpose. For those people, every single detail of their life is working together for one purpose, for good. We have to note, each individual thing that happens to us may not be delightful in itself, but their collective outcome is nothing less than divine. You might have one thing that happens to you, and you look at that thing and say, I cannot see how this thing could be good. But it's all these collective things that God is bringing together to bring out of us glory for Himself. All things, when Paul says all things include everything. God is weaving all the seemingly negative threads together to produce a positive tapestry. Is there anything about this story, if we didn't know how it ended, if we didn't know who the baby was, if we didn't know any of that, is there anything about this story that's beautiful or attractive? The answer is no. If left to stand alone, each thread may seem useless and unattractive, but when woven together, they collectively present a picture of something beautiful. I don't care what it is you've gone through. I don't know what you are going through or what you will go through. I can say with confidence, no matter how bad, no matter how painful, no matter how inconvenient, God is working to weave it all together, to bring it to a culmination, to bring about good things for those who love the Lord and are called according to His purpose. Allow me to illustrate this truth with the events we've just read. There are several inconvenient, seemingly accidental details, things that seem to be out of control, but actually the whole time the hands of God are on the wheel. The car is being divinely driven, if you will. If you look at this story just from the outside, it just seems like a bunch of random events that could not have come at a worse time. But the reality is God's hand is on the wheel. God's hand is on the gas. God is driving the car, and He's taking it to a good destination. Think about the specifics and the timing of this order. If the order had been given to register individuals by region rather than family, which would have been way more convenient for Mary and Joseph, if that order had been given, it would have been more convenient, but they would have remained in Nazareth. Furthermore, if the order had come any earlier or any later, Mary and Joseph would have found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. You know, you're students of the Scripture, you know where was Messiah to be born? In Bethlehem. I don't want to move on from this too quickly. There's something that dawned on me this morning. Of course, modern communication didn't exist in this time. It wasn't like it wasn't like Augustus just had someone pick up the phone, a secretary, and call up to Jerusalem and say, get everyone in Israel together and register them so we can tax them. Caesar gave this order. Somebody left Rome with this order, probably in a saddlebag, months before it ever got to Mary and Joseph. That means then, think about this, this decree was issued and the messenger left Rome months before God had even scheduled this divine appointment. It may, if you look at Joseph and Mary, it may have seemed to them like a major inconvenience at this particular time of year. When she's 9 months pregnant, it may have seemed like a major inconvenience to go to Bethlehem. But the truth was, think about this, God had moved an entire empire to get Mary and Joseph where they needed to be when they needed to be there. Do you see the beauty of that? Do you worry about well, look, what if I miss God's will? Can I tell you something? Our God is so big, so glorious, so majestic. If you want His will, He will move heaven and earth to make sure you're in the right place at the right time. God employed Caesar to get them where they needed to be when they needed to be there. Think about this. God had a Roman answer walking toward them months before they were aware of their need. If this order had been to register by region rather than by family, they would have never left Nazareth. If this order had come in just a little earlier, they could have made it to Nazareth and back before she ever had the baby. Or they could have made it to Bethlehem and back way before she had the baby. If it had come later, the baby would have already been born and there would have been a prophecy unfulfilled, leaving Christ unable to completely claim the title, the rightful role of Messiah. The specific and the timings of this order, yes, it was inconvenient, but it was divine intervention. Think about the long walk. Have you ever stopped to think, if this was Mary's first child, I've heard, so we're having our first baby, I don't know how many times I've heard, well, if it's the first baby, you'll probably carry a little late. Now, of course, all those things aren't always true, but just think about this. This is Mary's first child. What kept her from having a premature baby? What kept her from having this baby a week, 2 weeks late? Think about this. Every step of that journey must have been extremely difficult for Mary. I mean, the breathing, every time they have to stop and rest. It must have been so difficult for Mary, but again, God was in the inconvenience. Now, of course, Scripture doesn't say it, but think about this. Isn't it reasonable to assume that it was actually this journey that induced Mary's labor? One may ask, now how is this different than the previous observation about the time of the order? Let me respond this way. God used the inconvenience of the order to get Mary to Bethlehem, but God used the inconvenience of the journey to keep her there. What if Mary had been able, what if they finished their business and they said, look, there's a few hours of daylight left, why don't we turn around and go ahead and start on back towards Nazareth? Let's get a head start. It's the inconvenience of this long walk. She's wore out, she's tired, she has to stay in Bethlehem. The inconvenience, God was in it. In the most literal sense, her steps were being ordered by the Lord. And then again, the full end. One would think after all that God had put Mary and Joseph through, He could have at least provided them with a comfortable place to sleep that night, much less a place to give birth to His own son. You know, if the heart of the king is in the hands of the Lord, then doesn't it just seem reasonable to assume that He could have switched some things around in the innkeeper's notebook? If God could move Rome to accomplish His purposes, why couldn't God move somebody out of a room to give a place to Mary and Joseph? See, the reality is, had God done that, had God done what we would have done, there would have been an obscure yet very important prophecy, a necessary prophecy in the Old Testament that would have remained unfulfilled. Micah chapter 4 in verse 8, I might not put it up there, I'll just read it to you. Micah 4 verse 8 says this, "And you, O tower of the flock." Now I've preached on this before, I'm not going to go through it all again. "Oh, you, O tower of the flock." Tower of the flock is a specific Hebrew name. It is a place called Migdal Adir. Migdal Adir was the place where the shepherds would bring their sheep and inspect the sheep before they were taken to the temple to be sacrificed, before they left Bethlehem for Jerusalem. Micah 4:8 says, "And you, O tower of the flock, you Migdal Adir, the stronghold of the daughter of Zion, to you it shall come. Even the former dominion shall come, the kingdom of the daughter of Jerusalem." What's the it's talking about? It's talking about the coming of the Messiah. Migdal Adir was a place right outside, within the city limits of Bethlehem. The place where the sheep were inspected, the place where they were taken before they were to be sacrificed in the temple. And this is kind of what I picture. I picture Joseph seeing this little place right outside the city, just kind of sitting there in a field, and at least it's sheltered, and he runs there, and that's where Mary has the baby. Joseph's not thinking about prophecy. Joseph's not thinking about the Old Testament and the covenants and the promises. Yet all this time, God is fulfilling something that we would have overlooked, something that we would have forgotten. And God is making sure that his baby is born in the sheepfold, in the tower of the sheep. How fitting it is that the lamb was born in a sheep pen. How appropriate that the final sacrifice lay in the same hay where countless other lambs had lain. This full inn, it was so inconvenient. But God was in it. Now, as I kind of come to a close here, I want you to just think, Joseph and Mary were humans. Don't you think that there were points along the journey where Joseph just says, "I can't believe this is happening to us"? I mean, we have been so faithful to God. We've tried to serve Him. We've tried to do what's right. We've tried to be loyal. And here He's letting all these things happen to us. Don't you think when they're going to this stable or cave or whatever it was where the baby was born, don't you think Mary is thinking to herself, "Oh, please, not there. Oh, I mean, there's got to be a better option." Don't you think there was something rising up in them that said, "Why us?" We have a view that they didn't have at the time. Now we know it wasn't happening to them. It was happening for them and really for us. And we're all going to, at times, be like Mary and Joseph, and we're going to look around and everything is inconvenient. The government's breathing down our neck. We've got to walk 70, 80 miles to put our name on a piece of paper to agree to pay taxes for money we don't have. There's not even a place to stay, and we're just thinking, why us? And everything in life seems to be crumbling in on us, and we're thinking, why me? Why, God, have you done this to me? And what I want to encourage you to do, instead of saying, "God, why have you done this to me?" I want to encourage you to stop and say, "Okay, God, what are you doing for me?" I want to encourage you to slow down in the inconvenient moments and listen to hear the story that God is trying to tell rather than the one you're telling yourself. We get in these pity parties and we say, "I can't believe this has happened to me. Everything's going wrong." Even think about this. We're going down the road. Somebody's going slower than we want them to go, and we absolutely lose our minds just because somebody's going 5 miles slower than we want them to go. I mean, we just cannot believe that somebody would not be on our schedule. Right? That's how impatient, that's how temperamental we are. And even in the same way with God, we get so frustrated about all these little things, and we just, "God, why are you doing this?" When our question shouldn't be, "God, why are you doing this?" Our question should be, "God, what are you doing?" We tell ourselves this story about how everything's all wrong and everything in my life falls apart, and it's all just so inconvenient. And what I want to encourage you to do is stop listening to the story you're telling yourself and listen to the story God's trying to tell you. Next time you get frustrated because someone is causing conflict with your calendar, it may be a good thing to stop and recognize it may be God who's tampering with your timeline. I just can't believe that they got in my way. I just can't believe I did not make that light. But how do you know that's not the protection of God? How do you know that that job that you thought you needed would not have been the destruction of your soul? How do you know, and we could add 1,000 other things, how do you know that person that you thought you were supposed to marry, God knew that it would end up in absolute disaster? How do you know what God knows? And the answer is you don't. when you feel that you're forced to change your plans, when you're so aggravated, and even literally on the road, not just the road of life, but literally on the road, and you are so frustrated because somebody's going too slow, I want to encourage you to stop and recognize it may be God who is tampering with your timeline, and He's trying to slow you down to show you that He is doing a wonderful thing that you would not even recognize if you keep moving so fast. When you are forced to change your plans, be careful to consider it may actually be the hand of God directing your steps. How often have we prayed, God, please guide me, please show me the way. And then when He starts doing it, we buck, we kick, we fight against it. Remember what Mary said when the angel said to her that she was going to have this baby and it was going to literally be God's baby? Remember what Mary said? Be it unto me as you have said. How many times have you said in your life, God, I just want your will. I just want to do whatever you want. You've said, be it unto me as you have said. But then an order comes from Caesar, and it's at a bad time. And it's going to take you to a bad place, right? And all the while we forgot that God's in control, and we said to Him, be it unto me as you have said. Maybe God is actually in the interruption. Disruption may be a divine decree. Inconvenience may be intervention. We often stop our reading, Romans 8:28, we stop our reading at verse 28, but verse 29 completes the truth. The Scripture tells us, for whom He foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son, that He might be the firstborn among many brethren. What's the whole point? So Scripture tells us that it's all working together for good, but what's the good it's working towards? The good it's working towards is to make you look like Jesus. Whom He foreknew, He predestined. What did He predestine us to? To be conformed to the image of His Son. He predestined those who He has called to make them look like Jesus. The Son looks like the Father, and the Father wants all His other children to look just like His Son. And how does He do that? Sometimes He does that by putting in the heart of Caesar an order that's going to completely disrupt your plans. Everything God does is to make us look like Jesus, in whom He is well pleased. Have you ever said, I just want to please God? You know how you please God? You please God by being conformed into the image of His Son. You know how you're conformed into the image of His Son? Jesus was the man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. There's no way to become like Jesus without encountering trouble. When you wonder what in the world is God doing, I can answer that question. I might not be able to answer it specifically, but I can actually answer the question. When you say, what in the world is God doing? I can answer the question, and the answer is, He is conforming you to the image of Christ. And if patience is what you need, He is going to put that little blue-haired lady right in front of you on your way to church on Sunday morning. Right? If mercy, in order for you to look like Christ, if mercy is what you need, He's going to put somebody in your life that you're going to have to show mercy to. Yeah. Since Gregory's not here, you can fill in Janet. Friends, annoying inconveniences, whether minor or major, are often divine interruptions designed to make you look like Jesus. Why is that person I'm married to the way they are? Maybe it's for you. Right? Maybe it's something that needs not just to change in them, but something that needs to change in you. Was God not there when you said I do? Was God not there when He brought it together? Was God not the one who orchestrated the whole thing? Why is this person at work that just grinds on my last nerve? Why has God put them in my life? Well, to become like Jesus is to say, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. Annoying inconveniences, whether minor or major, are often divine interruptions designed to make you look like Jesus. At the moment, this hodgepodge of hassles must have seemed overwhelming and even off-key to Mary and Joseph. This probably sounded like somebody in the heart, it sounds like somebody raking their fingers down a chalkboard. It sounds like a first grade orchestra, right? It's sweet and all, but nobody really wants to sit through that. Yet hindsight proves all these random acts of inconvenience were the final tunings of an orchestra preparing to play the most beautiful song human ears ever heard, and that was the song of salvation, God becoming a man so that he could offer himself as the atoning sacrifice for sin. When baby God gave that first cry, that was the first time that God had spoken in Israel in 400 years. But it was such an inconvenient way to get there. Hindsight proves all these random acts of inconvenience were the final tunings of an orchestra preparing to play the most beautiful song human ears have ever heard. All the nuisances were necessary notes arranged by a God who was composing the greatest song ever written. I want to encourage you this morning, never forget the individual notes of salvation's song may sound unimpressive. If Donna was to just hit individual notes on the piano, it wouldn't do a thing for you. But if those notes are arranged right, it's Handel's Messiah. The individual notes of salvation's song may sound unimpressive, but when the conductor raises his hands, when all the instruments play the notes in order and in unison, the result is breathtaking. We look at all the things, but the reality is all the things in unison are working together to bring about the divine will of God, and the divine will of God is always good, and it is your conformity to Jesus Christ. The truth about inconvenience is that it's not random, it's intentional. Will you pray with me?